Hello, everyone, and welcome to Life Stories 1. This is where we come together to listen and share meaningful life stories, from simple joys and profound lessons to moments that touch the heart. Each story is a journey, a perspective that helps us better understand life and ourselves. If you're ready to join me on this adventure, hit that subscribe button and let's explore the wonders of these stories together in every video. The story begins on a rainy night along Carver Avenue, a weathered street tucked into the heart of Baltimore, where gray buildings stand quietly under the flickering glow of faded streetlights. Cold wind whips through, carrying damp air from the nearby Chesapeake Bay, making the night feel heavy and sticky. On this road, amid the steady patter of rain, like a mournful symphony, sits a small diner called Carver's Rest, a humble spot with a neon sign half burned out, casting a faint green flicker. Inside, warm yellow light spills from old ceiling bulbs, illuminating scratched wooden tables and vinyl chairs worn at the edges. This is where Amina Jackson works, a black waitress with deep brown eyes and a smile that holds a quiet strength, even though life hasn't been kind to her. Amina's no stranger to Carver's Rest. She's been there for 3 solid years, pulling double shifts from dawn to midnight, scraping by on just enough to cover rent and a few packs of instant noodles for her tiny apartment on West Pratt Street. With smooth brown skin and curly hair tied back tight, she moves between tables with the quickness of someone who's mastered the chaos of the job. Her hands, rough from endless hours of work, are always ready to wipe down counters, pour coffee, or carry hot plates to customers. But what sets Amina apart isn't her hustle. Everyone in this neighborhood grinds to survive. It's her kindness, a light that never dims, even when she's so tired her legs shake after a shift. That night rain falls nonstop, drumming against the diner's tin roof in a steady, lulling rhythm, like nature's trying to tell a story no one's listening to. The clock on the wall ticks past 11, closing time, but Amina's still there. She's behind the counter, wiping coffee stains off the wood with a damp rag, her eyes occasionally drifting to the window, where thick rain blurs the view of Carver Avenue. The diner's empty now, just the faint smell of toasted bread and cooled fryer oil lingering in the air. Amina likes these quiet moments when the clamor of customers fades, leaving her alone with her thoughts. But that peace doesn't last long. Through the fogged-up window, Amina spots a small figure outside, just under the weak glow of the Carver's Rest sign. It's a boy, hunched in a beat-up wheelchair, his thin arms clutching a tattered blanket. His dark hair sticks to his forehead, rain dripping down his pale face, and the thin jacket he's got on does nothing against the biting chill of the March downpour. His blue eyes, wide and lost, stare into the distance, like he's waiting for something, or someone, that isn't coming. Amina stops, the rag slipping from her hand onto the counter, her heart tightening. She's seen this too many times in her life. Kids left behind, people forgotten in this cold city. But this time, something pulls at her, something she can't ignore. Without a second thought, she pushes open the diner's glass door, the little bell above it jingling weakly. Cold wind rushes in, tugging at her hair. But she doesn't care. She steps outside, her old sneakers splashing in puddles on the cracked sidewalk, and kneels beside the boy. "Hey, hey, little one," she calls softly, her voice warm like a hug, despite the chill making her shiver. "What are you doing out here all alone? It's pouring." The boy flinches, then turns to her, his eyes wary at first. For a split second, Amina sees fear in them, but it fades into a flicker of hope. "I'm waiting for my dad," he whispers, his voice so quiet the rain nearly drowns it out. "He told me to wait here." Amina frowns, scanning the dark stretch of Carver Avenue. No one's there, just the dim flicker of a pawn shop's cash for gold sign a few yards off and the hiss of tires on wet pavement. "Where's he at?" she asks, concern creeping into her tone. The boy, Ethan, she'd learn later, shrugs, pulling the blanket tighter, though it's useless against the cold. Amina sighs, her breath puffing white in the damp air. She's seen too many nights like this, too many kids waiting for promises that never show. But she can't let it happen again. Not tonight. Not to this boy. You can't stay out here, she says, standing up and gripping the wheelchair's handles. It's too cold. You'll get sick. Come inside with me, okay? It's warm in there, and I've got something good for you. Ethan hesitates, his small hands clutching the blanket's edge, but then he nods. A tiny motion she almost misses. Amina smiles, a real gentle smile, and pushes the wheelchair through the door. The cold gets left behind as it shuts, warmth from the diner's old heater wrapping around them like a blanket. The smell of melted butter and burnt coffee fills the air, cozy and familiar, like a hug from the grandma she still remembers from childhood. She rolls Ethan to a table near the radiator, where the heat's strongest, and grabs a clean towel from the counter, draping it over his shoulders. I'm Amina, she says, kneeling to meet his eyes, her smile still there. What's your name, sweetie? Ethan sniffles, his hands gripping the towel. Ethan, he answers, his voice clearer now, though still shaky from the cold. Amina nods, like the name means something special. That's a good name, she says. You hungry? Ethan nods again, quicker this time, his eyes lighting up just a bit, like being asked makes him feel real. She doesn't wait for more. Amina heads to the small kitchen behind the counter, grabbing a fresh sourdough loaf from the morning's batch. The knife slides through the crisp crust with a practiced ease, the sound sharp in the quiet. Soon she's got a hot plate ready, golden grilled cheese, crisp and melty, with a bowl of tomato soup she made from her grandma's recipe, the kind she turns to when the world feels too hard. She sets it in front of Ethan, tucking a napkin into his collar. Here you go, she says gently. Eat up and warm yourself. Ethan stares at the food, his blue eyes wide with surprise. He takes a small bite, the cheese stretching in gooey strings, and a weak but real smile creeps onto his face, the first one that night. This is good, he murmurs, awe in his voice. Best thing I've ever had. Amina chuckles, the sound bright in the stillness. Glad you like it, she says, but inside, a familiar ache tugs at her. She knows this boy's carrying a weight no kid should. Loneliness, waiting, maybe hurt she can only guess at from his eyes. What Amina doesn't know, as she stands there watching Ethan eat with a child's delight, is that someone else is watching too. Across the street, a glossy black Bentley sits idle in the shadows, its tinted windows hiding everything inside. But from the back seat, Victor Grayson, a 46-year-old man with gray eyes sharp as steel and a face carved like stone, peers through the glass, tracking every move in the diner. Victor's no ordinary guy. He's the billionaire head of Grayson Innovations, a tech empire worth billions, run with precision and no mercy. He built it from nothing, with cold logic, hard choices, and a will that nothing could break. That night, Victor had told Ethan to wait by the diner while he handled an urgent call with investors in Tokyo. He hadn't expected a few minutes' delay to lead to this. His small, vulnerable son, the one he'd always shielded from the harsh world, being cared for by a stranger. Victor didn't buy into kindness. To him, everything came with a catch, a debt to settle. But as he watched Amina, this woman in a cheap apron with rough hands and soft eyes, feed Ethan without asking for a thing, something strange stirred in him. It wasn't gratitude, not quite admiration, but something deeper, something he hadn't let himself feel in years. He sat there, in the plush car with its soft leather and sandalwood scent, but his mind wasn't on Tokyo or profit margins anymore. He saw Ethan smile at Amina, saw the boy's thin shoulders relax, and he knew she'd done what his money and power couldn't in that moment, give his son a bit of warmth in a cold, rainy night. He pulled out his phone, fingers moving fast. "Lila," he said when his assistant answered, his voice low and flat. "Get to Carver's Rest. Find out everything about the woman who just fed my son." He hung up before she could reply, his gray eyes still fixed on the diner. Amina, meanwhile, wiped a smear of soup off Ethan's chin with a napkin, oblivious that her life was about to change forever. She just thought she was doing the right thing, like always, helping someone who needed it, with a meal and a few kind words. But across Carver Avenue, Victor Grayson had seen something in her, something he couldn't let go of, a debt he'd decided to repay in his own way. Victor Grayson wasn't a man who let emotions get the better of him. For 46 years, he'd built an iron wall around his heart, one forged from the cold steel of pragmatism and unyielding calculation. Sitting in the sleek black Bentley parked along Carver Avenue, he stared through the rain-streaked window, his sharp gray eyes fixed on the scene unfolding inside Carver's Rest Diner. Behind the fogged-up glass of the car, he was a solitary figure, cut off from the chaotic world outside. The plush leather seats and faint sandalwood scent of the interior did little to ease the tension simmering within him. Victor didn't like surprises, and he certainly wasn't used to feeling indebted to anyone. But tonight, as he watched Ethan, his small, fragile son, smile at Amina Jackson under the diner's warm golden lights, something unfamiliar stirred inside him, something he couldn't quite name. Victor didn't believe in unconditional kindness. To him, every action had a motive, a hidden transaction waiting to be uncovered. He'd grown up in the gritty slums of East Baltimore, where kindness was a luxury no one offered without a price tag attached. From a penniless kid, he'd clawed his way up to become the head of Grayson Innovations, a billion-dollar tech empire, by stripping away anything unnecessary. Emotions, weakness, faith in the immeasurable. Yet here was Amina, a woman in a worn apron with calloused hands, doing something he couldn't explain. Feeding Ethan, warming him up, treating him like a person, not a burden or a chance to cash in. She didn't know who Ethan was, didn't know he was the son of a billionaire, and that threw Victor off balance. He sat there in silence, his fingers tapping a steady rhythm on the door handle, a habit he fell into when he was thinking hard. Outside, the rain pounded relentlessly, drumming against the car's roof like the pulse of a machine. Victor wasn't one to hesitate. Every decision in his life had been swift, precise, like a move in a game he always knew he'd win. But this time, he felt himself facing something he couldn't fully control. Ethan, his only son, was the biggest vulnerability in his life, a secret he kept buried beneath his icy demeanor and tailored suits. Born with legs that would never walk, Ethan was a reality Victor had come to accept, but never truly moved past. He'd spent millions on doctors, equipment, and promises from top experts, but nothing could change the fact that Ethan would always need care. And tonight, that care came from Amina. Victor couldn't deny that her actions had struck a chord deep within him, a place he'd locked away long ago. He didn't believe in kindness, but he did believe in debts. That was his code. Everything had to balance out. Every favor had to be repaid. And Amina, whether she knew it or not, had just put him in her debt. He couldn't let that stand. He had to do something, not out of sentiment, because he wouldn't allow himself that weakness, but out of logic, out of the order he'd built his life around. He pulled out his phone, his fingers swiping quickly across the screen. "Lila," he said when his assistant picked up, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "Get to Carver's Rest now. I want everything on the woman who just fed my son." He hung up before Lila could respond, his gray eyes still locked on the diner. The next morning, as the sun peeked through the gray clouds over Baltimore, Victor had a slim file on Amina Jackson in his hands. Lila, with her usual uncanny efficiency, had dug up what he needed. Amina, 29, born and raised in West Baltimore, no college degree, living alone in a rundown apartment on West Pratt Street, working at Carver's Rest for 3 years. No criminal record, no notable connections, nothing remarkable, except that she'd survived hardships that would have broken most people. Victor flipped through the pages, his sharp gaze scanning the lines. The file didn't capture her kindness, but it showed him something else: resilience. And that was something he could use. He stood up from the walnut desk in his private home office, a sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. His black suit was tailored to perfection, accentuating his tall, imposing frame. He didn't go to Amina right away. He needed time to think, to decide his approach. But that evening, as the rain stopped and Carver Avenue glowed faintly under the streetlights, Victor stepped out of the Bentley and stood before Amina's apartment door. The building was a drab concrete block, its walls stained with watermarks, the stairs creaking under his weight. This wasn't a place for a man like him, but Victor didn't care. He knocked, the sound sharp in the empty hallway. Inside, Amina sat on a worn-out armchair, her bare feet propped on a small stool. She'd just gotten home from work, her soggy sneakers tossed near the door, her curly hair loose and damp from the previous night's rain. She wasn't expecting visitors, not at this hour, not ever, really. When the knock came, she frowned, got up, and peered through the peephole. The man outside made her pause, tall, broad-shouldered, in an expensive black coat, with a chiseled face and gray eyes that seemed to dissect her before she even opened the door. He didn't belong here, not in her world. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice firm, hand still on the knob. "Victor Grayson," he replied, his tone deep and controlled, as if the name alone explained everything. To Amina, it meant nothing. "What do you want?" She shot back, not budging. A pause then. "To talk," Amina hesitated. Her gut screamed trouble, told her this man carried something bigger than she could handle. But curiosity, and a streak of stubbornness, won out. She cracked the door open just enough to see his face clearly. "I don't know you," she said flatly. Victor's expression didn't shift. "You don't," he agreed. "But you know my son." Amina's eyes narrowed, her pulse picking up. "Ethan?" she said slowly, piecing it together. Victor gave a slight nod, barely noticeable. "I was there last night," he said. "I saw what you did for him." A chill ran down Amina's spine. "You were watching me?" she asked, a hint of anger in her tone. "I was watching my son," Victor corrected, his voice steady, unshaken. Amina crossed her arms, sizing him up. He was rich. That much was obvious from the way he stood, the way his suit fit like a second skin, the way he spoke like he owned everything. But she wasn't intimidated. She'd dealt with enough people in her life to know how to hold her ground. "So what do you want?" she asked again. Victor pulled a thick envelope from his coat and set it on her rickety kitchen table without asking. "A job," he said, "at Grayson Innovations. 6 figures, full benefits." Amina blinked, her brain stalling for a second. Then she laughed, a sharp, incredulous sound. "You're kidding, right? You think I'd work for some rich guy just because I fed your kid a sandwich?" Victor didn't smile. He tilted his head slightly, as if gauging how much patience she was worth. "I don't do charity, Ms. Jackson," he said, using her name for the first time, and it sent a jolt through her. "I pay debts. You've got something I need. Authenticity, the ability to read people. I saw how you treated Ethan. That's not something money can buy." Amina went quiet, her eyes flicking from Victor to the envelope. 6 figures. That was money she'd never dared dream of, money that could lift her out of counting every penny, out of sleepless nights worrying about rent. But she wasn't naive. Men like Victor Grayson didn't offer deals like this without strings. "You don't even know me," she said, her voice dropping. "I know enough," Victor replied, his tone solid as rock. "I know you didn't see my son as a burden. I know you did the right thing without being asked. That's rare." She studied him, searching for a crack in his words, a sign this was a trick. But his gray eyes didn't waver, didn't blink, like he'd made up his mind before he walked in. Amina glanced at the envelope again, feeling its weight without touching it. 6 figures. She could pay off debts, buy new shoes, maybe send some cash to her mom back home. But her mother's voice echoed in her head. "Don't ever owe these people anything, baby. They don't give without taking." She bit her lip, torn between harsh reality and that warning. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. Victor nodded once, a curt motion. "Good," he said, then turned and left, leaving her with the envelope and a decision that would change her life. The door clicked shut behind him, and Amina stood there, her hands trembling as she picked it up. She didn't want to admit it, but she knew she wouldn't just think about it. She was going to say yes. A few days later, Amina stepped into the glass tower of Grayson Innovations, her old heels clicking on the marble floor. She wore a discount blazer and thrifted heels, feeling like a fish out of water among the sharp-suited staff. This was a different world, one thick with power and pressure, where the air smelled like expensive cologne. She didn't know if she belonged, but one thing was clear. She'd walked in, and she wasn't turning back. Amina Jackson's first day at Grayson Innovations felt like stepping into a parallel universe, one where everything gleamed too brightly, edges were razor-sharp, and the air felt so cold she couldn't shake the sense of being an outsider in her own skin. The company's glass tower stood tall in downtown Baltimore, its modern lines slicing through the gray sky like a monument to untouchable power. Inside, white marble floors reflected light from crystal chandeliers dangling overhead, and the air carried a mix of metal and high-end cologne worn by employees in perfectly tailored suits. Amina walked through the revolving glass doors, her old heels clicking awkwardly on the polished floor. A sound out of place amid the hum of business chatter and the steady tap of keyboards on cutting-edge computers. She wore a navy blazer from a discount store and a simple black dress, holding her head high, even as dozens of eyes in the lobby swept over her, sizing her up, pegging her as different right from the start. Victor Grayson wasn't there to greet her. Instead, Lila, his assistant, a woman with neatly tied blonde hair and eyes sharp as knives, emerged from a hallway corner, clutching a sleek tablet. "Ms. Jackson," Lila said, her voice smooth but devoid of warmth. "Follow me." No small talk, no welcoming smile. Amina nodded and trailed behind her through wide corridors lined with transparent glass walls, where she glimpsed other employees working in sleek offices, each radiating a busy confidence she'd never seen back on Carver Avenue. It felt like walking into an arena where everyone was a rival, and no one was about to lend a hand to a newcomer like her. Victor's office sat on the top floor, a vast space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chesapeake Bay, where gray waves crashed against the distant shore. His walnut desk was pristine, free of stray papers or clutter, as if it were designed more for show than actual work. When Amina stepped in, Victor was seated behind it, his gray eyes flicking over her without lifting from his computer screen. "You're 2 minutes late," he said, his voice low and flat. Amina raised an eyebrow, settling into the leather chair across from him. 2 minutes, she replied, a hint of sarcasm in her tone. "Want me to apologize?" Victor finally looked up, his gaze locking onto hers for a long, probing moment, like he was deciding if she was worth his time. "I don't need apologies," he said. "I need results." There was no warm-up, no easing in. Victor slid a thick stack of documents across the desk, his long fingers tapping lightly on the cover. "Charles Wentworth," he said, "CEO of Wentworth Enterprises. He wants a deal with us, but only if we shift production to Southeast Asia to cut costs. That means thousands of workers here lose their jobs." Amina picked up the file, flipping through the first few pages, her brown eyes scanning the numbers and charts. "And you want me to do what?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with doubt. Victor tilted his head, his stare unwavering. "Convince him it's a mistake. Do it your way." Amina didn't answer right away. She studied Victor, trying to figure out what he really expected from her. She didn't have an Ivy League degree or experience in fancy boardrooms like this. All she had was the grit from years at Carver's Rest, where she'd learned to handle rude customers, stingy bosses, and days when tips barely covered a decent meal. But Victor didn't care about her resume. He'd seen something in her that night outside the diner, something she hadn't even recognized herself. And now he was putting it to the test. The meeting with Charles Wentworth happened a week later, in a frigid conference room with a long ebony table and stiff black leather chairs. Wentworth was a man in his 60s, his white hair slicked back, his pale blue eyes gleaming with the smugness of someone who'd never tasted failure. He sat across from Amina and Victor, flanked by 2 silent assistants clutching thick folders like bodyguards. "Grayson," Wentworth said, his voice smooth but dripping with arrogance. You know this is the only way to stay profitable. Moving production to Malaysia cuts labor costs by 30%. It's simple business logic. Victor countered, his tone cool but cutting. Your logic tears down the foundation Grayson Innovations has built over 15 years. Those workers aren't just numbers, Wentworth. They're our backbone. Wentworth smirked, a dry sound echoing in the quiet room. Sentiment has no place in business, Victor. He turned to Amina, his gaze sliding over her like she was a decoration not worth noticing. And who's this? He asked, a trace of disdain in his voice. Amina didn't flinch. She leaned forward, hands flat on the table, her brown eyes locking onto his. Amina Jackson, she said, her voice steady. Grayson Innovations, and I'm here to show you how wrong you are. Wentworth's brow lifted, clearly caught off guard by her confidence. But Amina didn't care what he thought. She was used to being underestimated, at Carver's Rest, on Baltimore's streets, and now here. It only fueled her fire. She slid a stack of papers across the table, her finger tapping the cover. Moving production overseas might save money in year 1, she said, her voice calm but sharp as a honed blade. But have you looked at the long-term costs? When labor prices in Malaysia rise, and they will because markets always shift, you'll shell out millions to restructure, rehire, and clean up the PR mess when headlines scream, Wentworth Enterprises betrays American workers for profit. That's not business logic, Mr. Wentworth. That's short-sightedness. The room went silent. Wentworth stared at her, actually seeing her for the first time, his eyes shifting from dismissal to something closer to unease. Victor stayed quiet, but Amina felt his gaze beside her, watching with a subtle satisfaction. Wentworth finally picked up the file, flipping through a few pages, his thin lips pressing tight. We'll reconsider, he said, his voice stiff, then stood and left with his assistants. As the glass door shut behind them, Amina let out a long breath, the tension in her chest easing. Victor turned to her, his expression unchanged but his voice a touch lower. Good work, Jackson. She smirked, a small but confident grin. I know what I'm doing, she said, and for the first time since stepping into Grayson Innovations, she felt like she belonged. But the victory didn't last. 2 months later, just as Amina was finding her rhythm in this world of power and pressure, a storm hit. She'd just returned from a client meeting on the city's outskirts, her heels crunching on the marble floor as she crossed the main hall. Lila intercepted her before the elevator, her usually cool face tight with urgency. We've got a problem, Lila said, her voice slicing through the air. Amina frowned. What kind of problem? She asked, but Lila didn't explain. Instead, she handed Amina a printed sheet, and the moment Amina's eyes hit the first line, her heart stopped. It was an internal email packed with sensitive financial data from Grayson Innovations, profit margins, costs, upcoming plans. It had leaked to the press, and worse, it bore Amina Jackson's name as the sender. She read it again, each word a stab to her chest. This isn't mine, she said, her voice trembling with anger and panic. Lila nodded, her gaze softening just a bit, showing a rare flicker of empathy. I know, Lila said, but someone wants it to look that way. Amina crumpled the paper in her fist, her nails digging into her palms. She didn't need it spelled out. She knew what this was, a setup, a trap laid to ruin her. In a place like Grayson Innovations, someone like her, a black woman with no degree, no privileged background, was the perfect scapegoat. She was called to Victor's office minutes later. He sat behind his desk, hands clasped, his gray eyes scanning her like he was weighing her worth. Tell me I didn't pick the wrong person, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Amina slammed the paper onto his desk, the sound sharp in the quiet room. This isn't me, Victor, she said, her tone firm despite her racing pulse. Someone's playing dirty, and they picked me because I'm the easy target. Victor didn't blink. The board thinks you did it, he said. Amina let out a bitter laugh. Of course they do. Someone like me doesn't get the benefit of the doubt here, right? Victor stayed silent, his eyes never leaving her. We'll find who really did this, he said finally, standing and slipping on his suit jacket. We? Amina echoed, surprised. You and me, Victor said, his voice resolute. Lila's tracing the email. It came through an external server, heavily encrypted. Someone covered their tracks well. Amina crossed her arms, meeting his gaze. And if we don't find them? If the board cuts me loose? Victor stepped closer, his eyes darkening. Then we make them regret it, he said. And for the first time, Amina believed him completely. That night, Amina, Victor, and Lila worked non-stop in a sealed conference room. Lila typed furiously on her laptop, tracking digital breadcrumbs, while Amina pored over the email line by line, hunting for clues. By dawn, they had the truth. The email traced back to a secondary account tied to Marcus Hensley, a senior executive with a decade at Grayson Innovations, a man known for keeping his hands clean while others did his dirty work. The evidence was in bank transfers and call logs Lila pulled from the system, all pointing straight to Hensley. The next morning, Amina marched into the boardroom, not as a suspect, but as a fighter. She dropped a thick folder onto the table, her eyes sweeping over the powerful men in expensive suits. I was the easy target, wasn't I? She said, her voice ringing out in the stillness. The newbie, the outsider. But you picked the wrong one to pin this on. She shoved the folder toward them, page after page of undeniable proof. Emails, transfers, calls to reporters, all linked to Marcus Hensley, not her. Hensley shot to his feet, his face pale, his voice shaky. She's lying! This is a setup! But Victor stood, his voice cutting through like a blade. No, it's not, he said, and Hensley went silent. Hensley's fired, effective immediately, Victor declared, his gaze sweeping the room. And if anyone else in this company thinks they can pull the same stunt, let this be your warning. Amina stood there, breathing steady, victory washing over her. She'd saved her reputation, not just with Victor and Lila's help, but with her own strength. From a waitress at Carver's Rest, she'd proven herself at Grayson Innovations, and she knew this was just the beginning. After her triumph over the board and exposing Marcus Hensley, Amina Jackson was no longer an outsider at Grayson Innovations. She'd carved out her place in that high-stakes world of power, not by blending in, but by standing firm on her own terms, with the grit and authenticity she'd carried from her days at Carver's Rest. That victory wasn't the end, though. It was just the start. Years rolled by, and Amina didn't just prove her worth. She reshaped Grayson Innovations in ways no one, not even Victor Grayson, could have predicted. From a waitress with soggy sneakers and rough hands, she rose to become vice president of corporate strategy, her name etched on a brass plaque outside the top-floor office, right next to Victor's. Those early years at Grayson Innovations weren't a cakewalk. After the leak scandal, Amina faced lingering skepticism from some board members who never fully bought into her presence in their polished boardroom. They saw her through a lens of bias, a black woman with no fancy degree, no elite pedigree, and pegged her as Victor's temporary misstep. But Amina didn't let it shake her. She worked twice as hard, 3 times as hard, poring over stacks of reports late into the night in her cramped West Pratt apartment, teaching herself the ins and outs of complex finances and business strategies she'd never touched before. She walked into meetings with bloodshot eyes from sleepless nights, but her voice stayed steady, her arguments razor-sharp. Slowly, the doubt turned to grudging acceptance, then respect, not because they wanted to give it, but because she made them. Victor, through all those years, remained an enigma to Amina. He never praised her outright, never clapped her on the back or tossed out feel-good platitudes, but he was always there, watching from behind his walnut desk, those gray eyes like a microscope, tracking her every move. He handed her bigger tasks, negotiating with global partners, handling PR crises, eventually steering the company's strategic projects. Sometimes Amina wondered if he truly trusted her or was just testing her, pushing her to the brink to see if she'd crack. But each time she came through, he'd give a curt nod and say, "Good." For Victor, that was the highest compliment she'd get. One of Amina's biggest changes at Grayson Innovations kicked off on an early morning, about 3 years after she'd joined. She strode into Victor's office with a thick file in hand, skipping the knock, a habit she'd picked up from him. "We need to do this differently," she said, dropping the file on his desk. Victor raised an eyebrow, not looking up from his screen. "Differently how?" he asked, his voice low and even. Amina took a deep breath, knowing what she was about to say might get shot down flat. "Grayson Innovations makes billions every year," she started. "But we're missing what matters most. The people who keep this machine running. Our workers, our community. We can't just take from them without giving back." Victor finally looked up, his gaze locking onto hers, blank as ever. "You want charity?" he asked, a trace of sarcasm in his tone. Amina shook her head, standing tall. "No, I want responsibility. If we invest in people, higher wages, keeping jobs here instead of shipping them overseas, training programs, we don't just keep their loyalty, we build something that lasts. That's not charity, Victor. That's smart business." He went quiet, hands clasped on the desk, eyes not leaving her. Amina knew he didn't buy into touchy-feely ideas, but she also knew how to speak his language, profit and efficiency. After a long pause, Victor nodded. "Put a plan together," he said. "Prove it works, and I'll sign off." That was all Amina needed. Within 6 months, she rolled out a slew of changes, raising the minimum wage for Grayson's factory workers, setting up skill training programs for entry-level staff, and pledging to keep at least 80% of production domestic. The board pushed back hard at first, calling it unnecessary spending. But when the numbers came in, higher productivity, lower turnover, better press, they had nothing left to argue. Amina turned Grayson Innovations from a cold, profit-driven machine into an organization with social responsibility, not by changing its core, but by showing that responsibility and profit could go hand in hand. But Amina didn't stop there. 5 years after joining, when she was named Vice President of Corporate Strategy, she pitched a personal project she'd been dreaming of, the Jackson Grayson Foundation. The idea came from memories of Ethan, the boy in the wheelchair she'd helped on that rainy night at Carver Avenue. She never forgot his smile as he ate that gooey grilled cheese, those blue eyes lighting up with a spark of hope she knew he rarely felt. Over the years, Amina stayed in touch with Ethan, catching up with him at Grayson events or dropping by Victor's place for work talks. He'd grown into a smart, funny, tough teenager, even though his legs still wouldn't move. He called her Miss Amina with a big grin, and every time they met, he'd retell the story of that diner meal like it was a treasure. The Jackson Grayson Foundation was built to help kids and families like Ethan, the overlooked ones, the ones who didn't get a shot because of where life dropped them. Amina funneled a chunk of Grayson's profits into it, setting up community centers, scholarships, and jobs for young people in West Baltimore, where she'd grown up. The first center, dubbed the Jackson Grayson Community Hub, opened on an old vacant lot near Carver Avenue, just blocks from Carver's Rest. On ribbon-cutting day, Amina stood before a crowd. Locals, Grayson staff, reporters, in a sharp teal dress, her new heels clicking on the hub's fresh wood floor. Beside her was Ethan, now 19, in a high-tech wheelchair Grayson had custom-made for him, his face beaming as he held the scissors to snip the red ribbon. "This isn't just a building," Amina said into the mic, her voice carrying through the big, bright space, its white walls dotted with kids' artwork. "It's a promise that no one in this community gets left behind, that everyone gets a chance to rise, like I did." The crowd clapped, and Amina glanced at Ethan, his blue eyes shining with pride. Victor stood in the back, arms crossed, his face blank, but his eyes different, holding a rare warmth Amina had learned to spot over the years. In the years that followed, the Jackson Grayson Foundation spread to other cities, Philadelphia, Detroit, carrying Amina's model, blending business with social good. Under her strategic lead, Grayson Innovations became a symbol not just of tech, but of positive change. She convinced Victor to back minority-owned businesses, launch mentorships for at-risk youth, even fund research to improve life for people with disabilities like Ethan. Victor never said it out loud, but Amina knew he was proud. Not of the profits, but of the legacy they were building together. Ethan became a constant in Amina's life through it all. After graduating high school with top grades, he studied engineering at the University of Maryland on a Jackson Grayson scholarship. The day he got his diploma, Amina and Victor were there, standing by him in a packed auditorium. Ethan, grinning wide with his degree in hand, looked up at them from his wheelchair. "Miss Amina, Uncle Victor," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I made it." Amina bent down, hugging him tight, feeling the strength in his grip despite his small frame. "You always could, Ethan," she whispered. Victor stood still, saying nothing, but the corner of his mouth twitched. A rare smile Amina knew was for both her and Ethan. Years later, sitting in her Grayson Innovations office, gazing through the glass at a Baltimore that had changed so much, Amina often thought back to that rainy night on Carver Avenue. That small act of kindness, bringing Ethan inside, feeding him, making him feel seen, had opened a door she never imagined. From a waitress scraping by, she'd become a leader, a change-maker, and above all, a source of hope for others. The Jackson Grayson Foundation wasn't just her achievement. It was proof that kindness, paired with grit, could ripple out further than she'd ever dreamed. One late afternoon, as the sunset painted the Chesapeake Bay gold, Amina stood outside the Jackson Grayson Community Hub, watching kids dash around the playground her foundation had built. Ethan, now a promising young engineer, rolled up beside her, his smile the same as that first night. "Miss Amina," he said, "what if we opened another center on the west side?" Amina smiled, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Great idea," she said. "You draw up the plan, and we'll make it happen." Ethan nodded, his eyes sparking with that same hope she'd seen years ago. Victor, older now with silver in his hair, but still ramrod straight, stopped by Amina's office sometimes to check on things. He didn't say much, but occasionally he'd pause at her door, looking at her with eyes that said what his words didn't. "You've done good, Jackson," he said once, his voice low and sure. Amina smirked, replying like always, "I know." But deep down, she knew everything she'd built, from her VP title to the foundation, started with one simple moment. A rainy night, a shivering boy, and a small choice that changed it all. From that act of kindness, Amina didn't just transform her own life, she transformed thousands of others. She proved kindness isn't weakness, but strength. That resilience isn't just surviving, but opening doors for those who come next. Standing there with Ethan, looking to the future, she knew their story, hers and his, was far from over.